This is PolarStar Cybersecurity Group. I'm Jackie.
And I'm Max.
So today we're going to have our episode 1. We're going to be talking about the FinTech space and common attack patterns. We're really just going to be discussing what are some of the things that security practitioners really need to keep their eye on in order to stay ahead, right, of some of the malicious actors that are out there, and also to protect the crown jewels, which is really the business and the data that's in there.
Absolutely. And from my experience working in FinTech industry and also have been being an offensive security engineer in the past, building product security programs, I've seen it firsthand. I've seen the attackers coming in from all different skill levels. I've been the one who's also doing the attacking on that side and learning about how can we do a better job working with our engineers, working with our product teams to build more secure products.
Cool. So today what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and dive into the transformative forces of the global economy, which is the FinTech space. So from digital wallets, real-time payments, AI is really taking up a storm. Everyone is talking about it. So what we're going to do first is we're going to talk a little bit about the FinTech space. What does that look like today? And then based on what we're seeing today, does that change how product security needs to be approaching, right, their day-to-day? So stick around, find out as we have this conversation back and forth. All right, so let's go ahead. The tech industry has so much jargon, even more so in cybersecurity. So before we dive deep here, I just want to talk about what is the difference between trust and security?
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting question because I think nowadays when we talk about security, we're seeing a lot of things where we say product trust and how we trust our businesses, right? There is a difference and they are both very closely related. So trust is really about doing the things that we say we're going to do. If I'm committed towards doing something, even if it's something as, hey, I promise to be at a game at a certain time, that is trust that I'm going to be there at that game, right? And the same thing is true when it comes to our product. When my product is saying I can handle, for example, 10,000 files, 100,000 transactions per second, that is a trust factor as to here's my guarantee to you that I'm going to be able to accomplish.
So what you're saying is trust is really being able to say or show that we are doing what we're saying we're going to do.
Absolutely. That's what trust is all about.
And then so security, what you've shared with me, it's really about putting the controls around and having that proof to show that trust?
Definitely. When we look at it from a security standpoint, security is a subset of that trust, right? But it is a trust, it's more of a representation of the trust of the controls we have put in place as an organization, as a product, that when you offload some of that data to us, that processing that you're trusting us to do for you, we've already thought about way ahead of time all the bad things that could potentially go wrong, which is partly the reason why you want to offload that elsewhere, right? Get that work done somewhere else. And we can demonstrate that we are doing a great job with it. We're doing what we can with it to make sure that we can protect your data and make sure that it's available for you when you need it.
So what you're saying is security comes first and then trust follows. Is
Absolutely.
that right?
The trust is an outcome of us doing a good job with our security practices.
So essentially security then is really all about risk management. So the activities that are executed on a day-to-day, daily basis, those are the controls that you implement to manage that risk. So when it comes to the FinTech industry, there's a lot of clamoring about agentic AI, embedded finance, things of that like. And there are even talks about this customer experience revolution. So that's where the experience will reign supreme. And it's really putting a lot of pressure on financial institutions to adopt a whole lot of new technology without really thinking about the security implications. Now, there are some pros and cons to that. So I guess in your experience and what you're seeing, how does security play here, right? When it comes to compliance, security, trust, it all kind of feels like a blocker to innovation. What's your take on that?
I think this has been the case in terms of this perception where security can be seen as a blocker for a lot of the business. And I think oftentimes in practice, it can really feel like that. And it comes from a foundation of security practitioners not really understanding, hey, what is the goal of our organization? What are we really trying to accomplish here? Because any innovation is going to take risk. And so I think one of the things that gets mixed up with a lot of security practitioners I've worked with, that I've seen as well in action, is that they're not willing to take on any sort of risk, right? And if they're not willing to take on any sort of risk, then they're also unable to really understand what is the problem we're trying to solve for and what are the parameters we're willing to work within.
So it goes back again, it's risk management. So it's not about eliminating risk, which I think is something that we've heard a lot in the industry. How do we get rid of all risk? Now, if there is no risk, right, you're playing it safe and you're not in it to win it, right? The whole point of being in a business, being in the tech game, specifically in the FinTech space, is you are trying to innovate, you're trying to be different, you're trying to do things that haven't been done before. So to have no risk at all, right? What is the point of even being in business? So security, it sounds like the role that they play is just being a bit of a checks and balance and saying, here are the trade-offs. But like, if you're okay with that, do it, because whatever feature you're looking to push out perhaps is worth that risk. Is that the relationship you seeing that we should take? Have you seen it already?
Yeah, I think from a should standpoint, absolutely is where we should be headed as an industry. Some of the strongest security professionals that I've worked with are really acting as a guide, right? As a security guide, as a risk guide for their counterparts and their stakeholders to understand, if I want to go this route, let's say I do want to build this new AI chatbot that's going to help us with our customer success agents. That is phenomenal, right? What is it that we're trying to solve for? We want to reduce the amount of time it takes for our call centers to respond to, how much cost we have when it comes to how long is our agent on the phone with people and how fast can things get resolved. These are totally reasonable business objectives to strive for. Now, a really strong security professional is going to understand, cool, when we are looking at this goal, what are the things that are taking us the most time? Is it something about like transaction disputes? Is there a certain limit that we want to have? And that's a conversation you'll see with a security professional have with the product and product management team, have with their business counterparts, and say, if it is, for example, that I've seen as well, $10 disputes, send it back. Because the amount of time, the amount of cost it's going to be for us to work with our human agent and validate a lot of these things, it just isn't worth the cost of the business, right? And if there's more that's required, if there's different things, there might be a subset of actions that we're going to allow that our agent's going to be able to do. But maybe our agent will not be able to do things like an external transfer outside of the account to an external bank, right? That will require contact with a human. So that it's really thinking about what are we really trying to solve for, and what are the things that we're going to be okay with. And if there are things that we know, inevitably, whether it's AI or not, or even going to write our own code for it, we're going to make a mistake somewhere. What are those mistakes going to look like? And then how can we make sure that we can govern for them so that we understand what our tolerance is looking like?
So I really like what you're saying here. So basically what I'm hearing, it's not a them versus us situation. It's just as in us, the business. So I think, like you said, this is a really common misconception around security being a blocker to innovation. And if you subscribe to the thought that trust, right, is a customer feature, then security is really not the enemy here. Is
Absolutely.
that right? So, okay, if we look at Claude versus ChatGPT, so let's talk about, as we go into this AI part of the world, Claude recently came out with this Claude security stuff. So it's not kind of to do with FinTech, right? Because FinTech is looking to do anything they can to make life just a little easier on the security compliance front. What are your thoughts around what's been happening with Claude security?
Yeah, I think it's really interesting. I think the fact that Claude Code Security has come out recently, and it's just more, for me, is a clear differentiator in terms of in the industry today, what we see in security and what we see in engineering as a whole. Code security is important. We've all known this, right? It's just more of a validation of the existing need in the marketplace. So that's kind of where we're at in terms of this being introduced. Now, I think the potential disruption that comes from it is the fact of, I've worked with a lot of these tools that are doing code scanning, whether they're AI scanning tools, whether they're traditional rule-based tools, or things that we've created ourselves that we have to manage all of our own rules and then roll out across different repos and different languages, all those complexities, running it on your own instances. I've dealt with all of those things. And I think one of the biggest challenge I've seen from more of a security operations standpoint, when we're looking at it from an AppSec or product security lens, is that at the end of the day, you just want to know, what problems do I have? Are they important? And can I solve them? And you don't want to have to deal with all those other things.
I think so what you're saying, I'm hearing is it's kind of a human problem, right? There's nothing to be said that bringing up these issues is a bad thing. It's just knowing which issues to solve. And I think oftentimes when engineers are working with their security partners, sometimes this context is lacking because everything seems to be about CSS scores, CVEs, things of that sort that aren't necessarily super relevant to what the engineers are building. So the idea of Claude Security coming in and being somewhat of a disruptor, the way I see it is that it's less the fact that it's a cheaper tool or a different tool. It's more that it will make the engineer's life just a little bit more efficient because they won't have to go through that sort of firewall of a human to try to understand what's going on. What are your thoughts there?
I think that is the route that security has been trying to push for a long time, right? With this whole narrative of push left that hasn't really gone super well. All of that code scanning, security code scanning specifically in the pipeline, even in the developer IDEs themselves, that was all in an effort to do the same exact task, right? It's the technology behind it was different. And I think one of the biggest challenges we saw in that kind of more traditional sense of traditional SaaS was management of the rules and what information do we send to the developers, right?
Yeah.
And I think that we'll still have a very similar influx, in my opinion. Whether an AI is going to be able to help us to identify issues faster, and maybe they'll have better, fidelity, right, in terms of how confident we are, and maybe it can start to do better reachability analysis, which we're starting to see in the market today, especially with the enhancements of all this AI technology. I think those are all positives, but at the end of the day, I think there are really two things. One is, as you mentioned, was the context is we as an organization, we still have to be the ones to provide the context to the engineers and to our organization as a whole that, for example, if it finds me a real life code execution vulnerability in my service, but I'm actually, as a developer, I'm literally just trying to test something to put it up and it's not going live anywhere.
Right.
And I just need something working so I can get a proof of concept because I have something like I need to present.
So it's like, don't bother me.
Exactly.
Like,
I really don't care right now. So it's like those kind of things that I think are still going to be a problem. Unless we can still, again, as a human, provide that context to what are the limitations that we have in terms of where we want these things to run. And I think the second piece here is that when it comes to Claude Code Security or any of these new kind of innovations I think we're going to start to see in disruptors, it comes down to ease of use. That's with any product. The easier it is for me to use it, and I think this is kind of where I was talking about before, where distribution here for any product in the world is the most important. Whether it is code security specific, if it's so easy for me as an organization to just turn it on, I'm going to do that. It's going to be easier for me. It's going to be less friction. And as long as I can access that, if the value is not fully there, if I can't even realize value at that point, to me, there's no value in probably a lot of other things that could be more advanced, right?
So we're talking about cloud security, and it feels like product security today feels really hyper-focused on vulnerability tickets and tools that just seem to generate a lot of noise, right? It's this noise. That's why cloud security is interesting, is maybe it'll help reduce some of that noise. But I guess to go back to what we talked about, how is that building trust, per se? Is it just security controls, or how are they all related?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think when it comes to when I've seen security programs, a lot of them, they're running purely off findings. How many findings do I have? What's my exposure look like, right? I think one of the things, if we want to be able to link this back into trust consistently, that I don't see a lot of organizations do until they start to mature a little bit further along their life cycle, is that they're really trying to understand the context of their own assets that are associated to those findings and what are the things that are impacted by it, right? If it is truly something that's going to be, if you can start to do something as basic as labeling that there is a specific asset that handles specific types of data, maybe it's PII data or maybe it's credit card information.
Right. So in FinTech, I guess, the value or the valuable assets is really just money movement, right? Because that's essentially what FinTech, that's what they're all about.
Correct.
So if it's all about protecting money at the end of the day, then it's whatever the product does to execute, that's really what you're trying to protect. So are there right and wrong security controls when it comes to protecting that money movement? And if there are, what might you mean by right and wrong?
I personally wouldn't say it's as binary as right and wrong. Okay. I think there are better and less good decisions, right? There are tons of security controls that you can think of for any sort of potential flaw or risk, right? It comes down to how much does it cost for us to implement? How complicated is it? How much is it going to cost for us to maintain it, right? And also, I guess, how to word it is like, how resilient is this control once we put it in place? So I think those are two things really important to think about. So I'll give you a high-level example here. And when it comes to something like something in FinTech, which is really core to FinTech itself, is like authorization. When somebody initiates a transaction, is this person allowed to initiate this transaction, right? At the most basic level, it's looking at the user and its roles, and that's essentially what it is doing. It's just saying, are you allowed to do this, right? And when we're looking at the different types of controls that we can put in place, of course, preventative is the most important thing for us to do, and validating that, but being sure that we can test the different conditions. So there might be in more complex financial systems, there might be limitations on that user's role in terms of time and also location of when they can execute. Also the limit of the limit of the transaction or the dollar value that they're allowed to transact. Those are all things that we also need to test and validate. And that's part of that trust to demonstrate that it does work the way that we intended it to.
So right and wrong, it's really, again, to contextualize. It depends on what does the business think is important, what are they prioritizing that day versus what they might be prioritizing a different day. So what I'm hearing is security isn't just a one and done job, right? It's just an ongoing thing, continuous improvement. We hear about that in the industry all the time. And those of you who are newer to security who are listening to this, one of the things that I would liken this to is it's like marketing, right? So just because you have a website doesn't mean your marketing is done and complete. There are social media posts, there are events, right? It's an ongoing thing that really needs to be reviewed and assessed and then redeployed, right? Based on what we're seeing and whether or not they're meeting the objectives of that company. And I would say security for some time now has not been run as a programmatic sort of discipline because, as you mentioned before, it's all been about vulnerability tickets, right? How many tickets are we addressing? But what is that actually doing? What are those activities doing to contribute back to the business? That's one of the things I would say is really what we're trying to push. It's something that we're seeing right with a lot of the leaders that we're talking to. So this is great. This leads me to the following. So we created a white paper on FinTech's common attack patterns. And there we stated that risk only exists because value exists. Can you explain why understanding the product's value chain is more important for a security person than just running a vulnerability scanner?
Yeah, for sure. I think when security first, a little bit of history, right?
Yeah.
When security first started to become popularized through CVEs, right? CVEs were originally a system developed so that way we could, as software vendors, could understand what is something that we need to update and that we know that we should patch, right? Because that was the only thing we had available at the time. As this expanded and grew over time, more open source software, more over reliance on different software that we're using, and that's not necessarily a bad thing. It makes things faster, it makes it easier for us to build, but there are trade-offs to that too. That means there are more people looking at this stuff, right? And therefore, the vulnerabilities technically have always been there. It's just when were they discovered? And so coming back to that, what security ended up becoming a lot like and how it became into this kind of big ticket machine was that you ended up having this huge list of things that you needed to patch. And competing with that, you have a whole list of things that you also still need to be able to, ship off for the organization. And then from that kind of combination together, we then have these competing priorities of one is for security, one is for the business, and it became this kind of battle.
So this is how we got to the us versus them sort of mentality, it seems like.
Because it came from a whole world of, this is now public information on how you can break stuff, and we really need to fix this. And technically true, yes, right? But there's also a whole lot of priorities for the business. And none of that, CV as a system was never designed to understand your business. It was simply a way to communicate to you, you're using the software, you should probably know that we found a problem with it, and it needs to be upgraded. Otherwise, it could be at risk.
Interesting. So the CV, that whole thing was really created just to be like, hey, we want to share information so that you as practitioners, you as the business, can take this in and make a proper decision. But it sounds like that step sometimes gets overlooked where we're not really contextualizing these problems. We're just saying, hey, it's a problem. And because there are so many of them, it then becomes really noisy.
Yeah, absolutely. And then as we started to move into a world where everything was software, every single business is now building their own software, that whole piece of finding the vulnerabilities within your own first-party code, which don't have a CV attached to it unless you're shipping that out to somebody, right, so that you have to let them know. Those things started to get merged together with that same existing workflow that came from the whole world of security patch management. And because of that, you then, again, kind of exacerbated this whole priority problem again.
So then this is where the product value chain can be really helpful in contextualizing all of these things that are coming from these scanners, these tools, sources.
Absolutely. I think that's one of the first exercises. When you are a brand new product security leader coming into an organization, the first thing that they should be doing, right, is to come in and understand what is this product serving and who is its customer base and what is the sensitive information that it handles and why do even users come here? Right? Why do they even care to use this product? By them understanding why users care in the first place, you understand what is the value for the business and what's the value for the customer and therefore the value for the business. At the end of the day, the business cares about growth, naturally, right? We want more users. We want more retention. We want to expand with those users and provide them more continuous value. And so to do that, the kind of root of all of this is knowing, do they come to us because, let's say it's a FinTech application. It makes it really easy for us to send money to our friends. Or it makes it really easy for us to understand my net worth, and see information. So those are the first things you need to really understand. So that way, if there are security flaws that can impact that specific line of value for our customers, we can now tie back to how is this going to affect the organization, and therefore, should I care?
Right, and then that's how we prioritize, is based on, it all comes back to, let's be honest, money, right? And money coming into our business,
right.
But money comes into our business because of the value that we provide our users. So what are those different features, those different capabilities that make that all happen? And that's really how we need to be contextualizing security and how we're prioritizing some of the things that we're seeing.
Yep.
So in the white paper, we kind of talk about why is it that as we modernize the financial services space, why is it that the user account has become the most critical and often dangerous asset in the company?
When you are looking at any FinTech application out there, at the end of the day, all it is one big, massive, complex authorization system, right? It is, and technically an authentication authorization system. Yeah. It's just saying, who are you and what do you have access to? Are you allowed to do it?
Yeah.
Do you have this money in your account and can you move it, right? Although that is a complete gross oversimplification of all those things, that is the core of what a lot of FinTech applications are doing today. And so I think when we're looking at the user account level, the user account is the one that has access to the funds, the transaction history, right? The sensitive information, whether it's PII, whether it's going to be banking information of that kind, right? And attached to all these things is if you have access to the user account, you have access to everything else. Even if you think about the payroll application, right? Which is not consumer finance, but those payroll applications, also FinTech, right? Facilitating money movement for the payment of wages. If you're an admin on there and you have access to that, you can see everybody's salary. You can move money from the company's bank accounts into these accounts that you technically have authorization to do.
So that makes a lot of sense. So I guess that's why, right, all the common attack patterns that we see are really all targeting information available in that user account. So, all right, so we had a lot of common attack patterns in there. I'd love to ask you, if you were to pull out the top 3 that you are the most concerned about, which of those would those be?
Yeah, so of the ones, I would say the top 3 that I have, the first one is user account takeover. And going into that just a little bit here, right? As we just talked about, like, user account is the biggest object of value within any FinTech application. And user account takeover is probably, it sounds hard, it sounds scary and technical. It's really not. It comes down to as simple as sometimes just guessing a username and password. Do you know somebody's email that you're trying to target? Likely.
Right.
And then do you know their password? Maybe not. But are there tools that can help you to get this information? There are things like on the dark web that you can purchase previous leak breach data or identify anything that was publicly leaked in the past if they haven't done basic security hygiene on their own selves, which can you say that all your users do? Probably not.
And
right?
To bring it back to AI, it just makes it so much more easy, right?
The barrier to entry for attack has become much easier. Now, of course, some of these AI tools, they have some kind of guardrails in place to make it more challenging for
but
you.
we've all seen that.
Right.
It's easy.
They're not
you can go over them.
Impossible to bypass. But user account takeover is probably the biggest thing to be able to do because it doesn't require a high level complexity and gives you insane access.
So what are the recommendations for a practitioner or even a business to really focus on in terms of their investments to de-risk these types of attacks?
I think when it comes to that, the organization really needs to understand what is the entry point here. The entry point is how people log into your account, right? And of course, there are more technicalities in terms of session takeovers. We want to get deep technical, but if we're looking at it just pure bare bones basic, we need to see when we are logging in and for the users, what controls do we have in place? Are there things like brute force protection, right? Is password complexity something we care about, right? I've seen cases where password complexity is something that maybe we don't want to have as intense because of a certain user
Trade-offs.
base. Right, there are certain trade-offs. So if we're targeting, for example, maybe a younger audience, and what we see as an outcome is that we might also be measuring, what is the amount of successful password resets are we seeing? And we're seeing a lot of people hit forgot password. It could mean that password complexity is not super strong for us, or maybe our login flow is not super resilient, right? So it's not very intuitive. So these are all things that I feel like as a security practitioners, It's really easy to forget and just think about it as, hey, we don't have this control in place. We got to make sure we get this done. As opposed to, what is the business measuring for success here? How do we make sure that we have the right controls there and make sure that it is easy to use?
So it's really about partnering with your product leaders, right?
Yeah.
All right, you guys know the product best. What are you trying to accomplish with the user that you also know better than I do, right? Because you said some trade-offs. I really like that you mentioned, because there are some apps that I've been on that I forget the password every single time, and I've got to hit forgot password almost literally consistently. So especially if you want your user to have a frictionless experience when they come in to use your application, keep it sticky, keep them coming on, they can't keep forgetting, right? So that you as a security team need to think about what is that right balance. It's not about providing an ironclad password that you will never remember. It's perhaps implementing different features to make it easier.
And I think that this goes back to our previous conversation about the controls, right? What's a better control maybe, right? And is an option for us to make the password extremely simple? That is an option. But another could be something, maybe we want to consider implementing passkeys. So that way we do still have a lot of security guarantees, or I should say security buffs that we wouldn't have previously from a really simple password. But we are still then able to provide some level of control and options for our users. And this goes back to also from a user design standpoint. We don't necessarily want to put our users in a complete rigid path either. We want to give them options for how they want to secure their accounts. So another example I'll throw in there is MFA is starting to become much more standard, which is great to see. But we're still seeing things where we have really simple authentication codes coming back, right? Maybe 4 digits, and maybe they're just numbers. And sometimes they forget to do things like brute force protection on there, so you can just guess it as long as you password, or you can smash it with an automation, which is also not very hard to do. But then we start to see things coming over SMS, technically less secure, right? There are SIM swapping attacks that can challenge that as well. But if we look at providing the user an option to say, hey, it's not to say you can't use SMS, it's if you want to have better improved security posture for your user account, we might offer using an authenticator application. So you have a time-based OTP. So that way, you've probably seen those as well, where you enter a code that comes from another app.
Lots of my Bitcoin apps
Exactly.
have all that. So,
and is it required? Maybe they will require as a product. We might say as an organization, if you have a certain amount of money in your account, you're going to require it.
There we go.
That's a big deal for us, and it's a big deal. It should be a big deal.
And as a user, that's something I would honestly appreciate. Yes, there is that extra hurdle, but you understanding the user, money that they have in their account, and sharing with them the purpose of this builds that trust, so they know it's safe with you.
Right, exactly. And that's really what it comes down to. When we're looking at these FinTech products, right, you're not standing next to them. As the product manager or as the executive of this organization, you're not standing right next to your users every day to see how they use the application. They're trying to get something done at that moment, and that's their interaction with you as an organization. That's to the most of their extent. They ideally don't have to call customer support or contact customer support. So
I'd much rather not.
Exactly. You'd rather just be able to check your balance and make your transaction and call it a day. And so to build that trust in there demonstrates to your users as well, we understand the value that in the trust you place in us, and we're reciprocating that as well to you.
So again, all back to trust, right? So account takeover, that's the first one. Yep. So what's the second one?
Yeah, second one here would be for financial fraud. A lot of the times account takeover is kind of the first step technically to start doing financial fraud. We've seen for FinTech applications, right? I think when we look at financial fraud, we look at it just at, I think the most basic way to look at FinTech apps is to say, all I want is to take money out of this platform. Which, sure, that's going to be a lot of things. But there are many ways to get money out of a platform rather than just compromising a single account and pulling the funds available from that account. That's one of them, and that is definitely a form of financial fraud. Others can be things like doing a lot of disputed transactions. So an example that you might see is that if you have some sort of, let's say, an intro offer, as you say, for customer growth, maybe you offer X amount of dollars for you to come into the platform. Great. One of the things as an attacker, from an attacker point of view, that I'm first going to think of is, how do I maximize your offer for me? Right? That could be creating a ton of fake accounts with as many synthetic identities as I can get.
And if you don't have the controls in place, from a business standpoint, this looks great. Right? Yeah. I'm like, wow, I have so many new accounts.
Like this marketing plan, this new promotion.
This website.
It worked, right? You've got a bunch of these new things coming in. And if I am an attacker and I come in and I say, great, I'm going to create this massive, actually it won't even have to be really massive, but I'm going to create this little botnet that has access to maybe 50 to 100 different IPs that I can purchase. And then now I'm going to create a bunch of accounts that I took a bunch of fake identities or real compromised identities off the dark web. And I paid for them. I can use them on all different platforms. It's not just for this one. I got to make the most use of my investment as an attacker as well. I'm going to create a bunch of accounts. And if it's something as like, hey, you just have to transfer money from one account to another, great. I have a bunch of these mules that I can transfer money to, redeem the offers, and then send it through a whole network of accounts to each other in order to clean out money from the organization. And now, as we are starting to, if you look at that, right, none of that had to do technically any hacking, right? If we look at it from a technical hacking point of view of trying to abuse some sort of logic or something, we are abusing logic, but it's valid logic, right?
Right, but this is still product security.
It's product security because it comes down to these were controls and features that were designed by the organization that I'm just happen to take advantage of to do it.
So then, same question as account takeover, right? What is the best way to de-risk a business when it comes to financial fraud? This sounds like a pretty clever way to be able to put a little cash in your pocket. How does a business think about mitigating some of that risk?
Yeah, absolutely. I think for a business, when they're looking at financial fraud, you really have to look at fraud from a life cycle, right? Every time we bring in something new, even if it is going to be this promotional offer, right? We, as security professionals, need to really think about what is the limitation that can happen here? What is the maximum loss that could possibly happen? And
what's our tolerance, our risk tolerance?
Right? And I know those are just, at this point, just fuzzy questions, but these are the discovery questions we need to answer when we're still really early in our design phases, right? When that idea has first come out from our product and marketing team saying, hey, we found a need, and this is something that we need to be able to solve for, or this is something that we want to explore in order to expand our reach, right?
I will say from an operational standpoint, because I've talked to a lot of leaders where they're doing something for the first time, they don't have any data. And I think one of the biggest fears is, well, I don't know what is the right tolerance, what is the right benchmark. My recommendation to any of those leaders out there who are having those questions is just draw a line in the sand, right? Just say something, put a number out there, and then you will actually have something to measure against. So if you're noticing that a lot of things are happening, right, that are above or below, all you have to do is move that benchmark, right? And over time, you will find something that fits and feels right for your organization. But when you're first starting out, there's no way that you'll know. And that's really okay, right? And that is the whole point of this life cycle management, understanding your users better. From a sales and marketing standpoint, which that's where my specialty really lies, it's the exact same thing. They don't know what they're doing, right? They're just putting numbers out there, and they're lucky enough to have some industry averages. I would say that in security, it's a little bit more difficult because people are more hush-hush about some of the problems that they're seeing or having. So we don't have as much public data. But that's where experience kind of helps because you've seen things at different companies. So at least you can put a benchmark or put a line in the sand somewhere and then move forward from there. But to not have anything at all is really a detriment to the program and to the business at large.
And I think that is that kind of mentality when it comes from security. It comes from the fact where we've always heard this narrative of defenders have to be right all the time as opposed to the attackers just having to be right? And is it true? It is true to some extent, right? Is it possible for an attacker to completely take down your organization in one fell swoop? Yeah, that's possible. But for that to happen, you really have had to have messed up a lot of things, right? Your response to it, the amount of blast radius that sort of attack vector had on you, meant it is more of an indication that we didn't have that kind of layered defense approach. And even in that example that we just talked about with how would you do financial fraud with some sort of financial money promotion giveaway sort of situation, right, or to sign up, is also thinking about, could we region lock it, right? There can be certain things that we say, let's try it just on the West Coast, or let's try it just in this country for now. And if it happens from there, and there's a certain cap on what we're willing, how many new accounts we're willing to push out, let's evaluate, investigate, are these real users?
Yeah, no, that's a really
that's
good
idea.
idea.
That's part of our playbook.
And as you were talking about that, it brings me back to security culture and just culture in general, right? So I do think it really sucks for a lot of security leaders where this whole idea of the attackers, if they're right once, then it's a problem for us. And all of a sudden, it's our fault. But if you look at other departments within an organization, again, I'll bring it back to sales and marketing, right? Bringing in revenue is just as important. You lose a really big deal. What happens? Right? So the tolerance has to be understood on what is okay, what's not okay. Because if there is no tolerance at all, then you have to invest more in security. You can't just say, hey, security, you're going to get a shoestring budget, but guess what? You can't have any mistakes whatsoever. And if you do, you're going to lose your job. And I think that's one of the problems that we're seeing and hearing in the industry today is like we see a lot of cases where that is true, and it comes from just top leadership not really understanding the value that security brings. And hopefully, right, what we work with security leaders will help bridge that gap a little bit, because arguably security is a customer feature, especially when it comes to the fintech space.
Absolutely. And I think that, again, brings into the discussion here where we invest a lot. The current kind of strategy is to invest a lot into prevention, which is, sure, yes, very important for us, right? But I think that other side of house is we fail to invest adequately in preparedness, right?
So our resilience, we even test resilience if nothing has ever really happened.
Exactly. So if we assume breach, just assume something bad's going to happen. How fast are we going to be able to identify? Do we have controls in place to even monitor for weird behavior that's happening in production, that's happening at the application level, right? To see those sensitive functions that we care about are really getting slammed hard. And if there is something that's going on, then what is that whole, we look at it from an operational point of view, what does that flow look like to notify customers? Because is it going to be us scrambling and trying to figure out who was affected and all this stuff? Or do we have an existing process that we've tested out? And not necessarily to go ship out to real life customers, but we've at least run some testing so that we've run through the plan and know that it works to some extent.
And so for financial fraud, it sounds like preparedness and just being able to have all of those operational sort of processes in place for that seems like really important to help mitigate the risk associated with that particular attack pattern.
Absolutely. And so when we're looking at it from a design standpoint as well, right? If we identify as a team and we say, hey, this could open up opportunities for fraud, great. We don't have to go into every single detail.
And fix it.
Right? Yeah. And figure out, hey, what are we going to do when something happens? Because realistically, we're probably a fast-moving fintech and we need to go ship out. But we need to understand this could happen. If this happens, who are we going to invoke? Is legal involved? Are they at least notified that if this was to happen, what's the level of liability that we have here? And what should we put in place if this is too much for us?
It's hard to argue that it will happen if it's never happened and it's a brand new feature, right? Yeah. So I think that's something I've seen is really challenging with security as well, is we'll ship something or we'll build a new feature and then security will come in and tell us all the things that could possibly go wrong. And it's like, oh, great, but what's the likelihood? Mm-hmm. Well, we don't know because it's never happened before. This is a brand new feature. So that conversation that you're talking about, I think, would be extremely valuable in building just a stronger partnership between security, between engineering, between product, and just saying, instead of saying, let's fix it now because we need to push this thing out, it's, all right, fine, push it out, but now that we know what problems can exist, we're going to implement controls or monitors to just make sure that it doesn't happen. And if it doesn't happen, we don't need to change anything. Nothing needs to happen. But if we do see something, then we all agree that we're going to come back to the table together to figure out how do we create something a little bit better so that fraud risk is a little lower within our organization.
And as you go through that, part of that is really thinking about how much effort, if we want to think from cost standpoint, that's fine too. How much effort is it for us to put in those controls? If it's super high effort and we can't be for sure that it's going to help us, then that is a good candidate to put on the table for later. Right?
So what I'm hearing is, like, security, stop trying to hold your ground so hard. Just let it happen, be a partner, and just allow things to move forward, knowing that, I think fail-safe is the wrong word, but that there is a fail-safe, that if something does go wrong, you at least have the proof, the evidence, and the talking points to address it.
Right. And I think the important thing to highlight here is it's not go easy, right? It is be pragmatic as to what we can do today. And also you need to make sure that you have the governance process in place that if something does happen, you're going to find out.
Right.
And that we can come back to that conversation as opposed to
know who to talk to.
Right.
Yeah.
Instead of just being like, oh, everything's fine.
So, all right. Well, that's the second one. So we've got account takeover. We've got financial fraud. What's your top three. What's your third one?
Yeah, the third one I'd say is absolutely authentication and authorization. Like I mentioned earlier, FinTech at its core is essentially that. But the reason why I wouldn't necessarily put that as the first one, though it is kind of the core to it, is that when we look at a comparison from user account takeovers and financial fraud, then the difference is that the level of technical skill you need to really abuse authentication and authorization, it's not necessarily high, but it is higher than that of the others, right? From the others, you really can do this from your basic scripting attempts at it, right?
What are they called? Script kiddies?
Yep. The basic script kiddie can do it. Can you attempt as a script kiddie to do authentication authorization flaws? Sure. There are ways to do it, right? And it's starting to become more and more accessible, especially with the tools available today and the way that people have been learning today. I think that's a good thing, right? At least from a security research standpoint. But the other thing that it shares in common with the others is that each one of these require the attacker to have a really deep and intimate understanding of your application. So if we go back to authentication authorization, what this really means is just understanding the APIs behind each button press, each scroll, everything that's going on behind the scenes. What are the back-end calls that are happening to go enable all of that to happen? And that's where you'll find the things where, as a basic application works, right, is it's going to have to reference an ID. It's going to have to reference the existing user that's logged in, maybe through a authorization token or something like that. And it's going to have to reference an account number and a value of some kind. And us swapping between those two things or a couple of those parameters, oftentimes you will find things that feel really basic and that come straight from a textbook, and it happens in real life. And the reality of it is that it's usually not of pure negligence where developers don't know or engineers don't know. Anytime I've ever presented one of these issues to an engineer, they'll, oh shit, that should not be there. They know it's not supposed to be there, right? But when you look at a fast-moving organization that doesn't have those controls in place and building that good practice in place, and they're just depending on strong, smart, fast engineers, then even a human, that's going to mess up. And when we start thinking about AI development and all this enablement that we're having, if we don't have the right things in place either, their robot is going to mess up as well.
So what I'm hearing is this isn't out of negligence. It's not because they're purposefully not doing it to be faster. It's not a priority, and that's okay. That's the reason why a security team exists, is to be that checks and balance, to be like, oh, hold on. Hey, this is an awesome feature, but I forgot this very basic hygiene thing. Just don't forget that.
And you can, I think one of those things is we can absolutely leverage some of this new AI technology to help us there. But in order to get there, for authentication and authorization, that is not something an AI can really decide for you. It is a product decision. So I'll give you an example, right? If you have different roles within, we can go back to the payroll application, right? You might have admin users, you might have different HR specialists and all these things, right? They might have different roles and different permissions available to them. It is not up to my AI to go guess what each role type is supposed to have permissions to do. It is up to me as a product leader to understand for the personas I'm trying to solve, for the challenges that they're trying to address, then what are the permissions that they should have access to? That's what I need to have written down. If I don't have it written down at all, I can't even send it to a tester to validate that for me consistently. Maybe I can give it to somebody internally who really has that tribal knowledge, but if that person leaves next month, I'm screwed.
That's a good point, because I think today when we talk about AI, we think that they're going to be a savior of this world. They're going to just do everything for us, but you still need a decision to be made. Even for humans, making a decision is hard. Imagine a machine doing it. They can do it, but it's probably an arbitrary decision with not a whole lot of context and thinking, right, in terms of the business objectives behind it. So what I'm hearing is, yes, authentication, authorization, it's third of the top three, but it's simply because it requires a little bit more technical prowess. Now, things might change, right? As people get smarter, AI gets smarter, but still, amongst account takeover, financial fraud, because those are so, I guess, simplistic in comparison, authentication, authorization just happen to fall on the third of course, the top three.
Right, and I think it's just really at the end of the day, it is not something you think about first for the most part when you're creating a product. You're thinking about what problem am I solving for, right? What function do they need access to? And I think this is also reflected in even OWASP's most recent top 10. These flaws are number one for web apps today. in the latest 25, they published all of these authorization flaws as the biggest issue. And I think that's just more of a testament. We've been seeing it rise higher and higher. And it's more of a testament to, as we're developing products and software, writing software is becoming more accessible. It's becoming easier. It's not to say that it's easy to do. It's hard to do well, but it's easy now to get started. And because of that, we're seeing this problem become more and more prolific than we've seen ever before.
So what is your recommendation then to organizations to, again, this is a common attack pattern. How do we address this?
I think one of the most funny things I see is anytime I've talked to somebody about this, they want this problem solved and over with. And when you have a problem like this that is so inherent to your product itself, it's not as easy as, let me buy this vendor and it's done, right? There are several approaches to it, but I think to not have to rely on a vendor, to really think about what are the basic things I need to get done, what is most important is it comes back to our value chain, and then thinking about from our features that we have, what are the most sensitive features that we have that are most valuable to our users? That would, one, what do they use a lot? And then second, of the things they use a lot, what allows them to do something powerful or interesting, whether it's money movement, balance checking.
So this is how you prioritize, because I think security, there's a lot of just like you get overwhelmed because there's just so many APIs, so many things that need authentication, authorization to be looked at. But in a way, that's why we're like, hey, we want a tool because we just want someone to take care of it. There's just too much. But what you're saying is there is a way to narrow the scope so that you can do it well within your business.
Yeah, exactly. Can you get a tool to help you to solve it? Absolutely. But will you require probably a lot of additional maintenance on top of it? Most likely, right? And I think this is, I've had this discussion previously before. We were looking at this FinTech application, and basically they had a huge problem with authorization. And they said, man, I really want to get this solved. Cool, let's take a look. We started getting them a little bit of discovery work, and first question that most people ask is, how many APIs do you have? They didn't really have a good answer. After a little bit of investigation, there's like 4,000 public APIs that are available, that are being served by the backend. And it feels overwhelming. 4,000 APIs, what am I supposed to do
I've talked to companies with more.
Exactly. More than that, right? And then if you have that type of volume, we haven't even gotten started, then how are you supposed to really scale this out? And this kind of comes back down to knowing how to chunk things out, which is just basic practices of slowly scaling. But to prioritize is that kind of core skill that we need to have. And if we're able to cut down to what is the password reset flow, for example, that's within the application that you're authenticated inside of, the checking account, balance checking, updating your personal information, external wire transfers, those kind of things, we're able to cut that down pretty far, right? Down to just 30 APIs. And we are not saying all other 4,000 don't matter. It's that if we can roll this out for 40 APIs and we can show that it's working and we can show that those controls and the basic controls that we'll have in place is to do some automated testing. The first level would just be call the same API call, same body, same request headers, and then just swap out the auth token. That's the most basic one. If we can do that for 40 APIs and prove that for every new change that comes in, that control stays resilient, we're doing a good job so far, right? Then we expand the test cases out further to do include other things as well. It's not something that, of course, we want this done as soon as possible, but there are times just like this where slow is fast.
It's about incremental progress because it's expensive to do, right? Oftentimes, especially if you want to bring in a vendor. But is it right to say you don't necessarily need a vendor for something like this?
I think it's right to say you may not necessarily need a vendor unless you can really justify it. I think a lot of security teams will just throw out and say, I just want a vendor to handle it. That's okay. That is a choice, but that's going to cost you, right? It's going to be expensive for you to swap out vendors in the future if they start to jack up prices on you, or if they get acquired by somebody and they don't provide the same quality of service that they had used to provide to you.
Let's talk about some real examples now and just put everything we talked about into context. I'd love to bring up the Cash App case. You noted that attackers didn't exploit software vulnerabilities, but rather legitimate product workflows. How does a security team defend against someone using the product exactly as it was built?
I think when we look at the Cash App case, this is an example of financial fraud. So financial fraud here, basically what regulators had deemed was that Cash App created an environment where financial fraud could be prolific and spread throughout their platform. And they chose not to make certain design decisions around it. And arguably, right, when we're looking at it from a product standpoint, you have more legitimate user accounts. You have more transactions happening. All the things that you would typically measure for success are happening. And I can totally see the case as to why it might be overlooked or just not brought up to attention as much, right? But when you're looking at it from a product security point of view, the important thing to note here is that product security teams, they operate in terms of being able to see, or if they've done their job properly, right, they can get the monitors and monitoring controls in place to identify user behavior before a transaction. And then they can also see transactions happen, but as opposed to from a risk team, risk operations, they tend to see things happening after a transaction has happened, after an external transfer has happened, after a dispute has happened. So what I see a lot of the times is that risk operations and product security teams often operate completely separate from each other. One is looked at as a very technical control standpoint, just like encryption and making sure that we have the right authorization controls in place and input validation. And the other is looking at all sorts of information of the user transaction history and how much are the values, right? And if we're able to merge these things together, these two disciplines together, we can find really interesting stuff. For example, if we can identify certain behaviors from a user that tends to report fraud, right? That we see a bank account, an external bank account being linked or unlinked or changed, right? If we see that modification happening across a lot of successful cases, this gives us a really good opportunity for product security to investigate what are the user behaviors that we identified within the application before. A login from a country not from their typical country of origin, right? These are signals that I think and opportunities that product security teams have that they can merge with risk operations to identify really interesting things and lead us to that path of proactive risk detection and fraud detection before the transaction ever takes place.
I think you bring up an interesting point because FinTech is kind of a fun space, right? Because it's bringing in some of the risk management stuff that you see traditionally with financial institutions, but it's also bringing in some of the more technical aspects of software engineering, which is why you have a security team. But what we haven't seen a whole lot of is the blending of the two, right? Because they often sit in separate departments, and because of that, and they don't necessarily speak the same language, it's sometimes just easier for the two to just be separate. But for cases of fraud, there's some really awesome stuff that can happen if they were to just talk to each other and compare notes a little bit, because fraud sees things after the fact. Product has a view into the product, how you get to that fraud. So if we were to just put the two together, the company might be able to prevent a whole lot more just by merging two disciplines a bit.
I think that doesn't happen necessarily on day one, right? The beginning piece of it, that discovery effort, is really to validate the existing fraud cases that we have, which you would have data for, right? We can also capture the data or what signals we have available that led up to that. And that's something that product security can support risk operations for that investigation and identify proactive rules. And over time, we can start to build a better case for what that looks like. I think the challenge when it comes to financial fraud is that fraud evolves, right? It changes as our product evolves. It changes as our attackers are looking for new ways within our platform itself. And this is just a good example for, we may not be able to prevent every single thing, but there are going to be common signals across all of these cases that we can provide additional value for as a service partner, really, to our risk teams.
And this is a worthy place to invest. And the reason I say this is because in the Cash App case, in this white paper, it cost them a little over $300 million in total because of this fraud, right? That happened on their application.
That's including the refunds they had to do back to their customers. That's including the litigation fees that they had from a legal standpoint. That also includes, not even all of it, of the increase in investment they had to have for financial fraud and risk investigation. That it's a practice they could have built out earlier and had prevented some of these, but hindsight is always 20/20. So this is just a good learning lesson for anyone else in the fintech space to start building this practice out earlier than later.
So, speaking of practices, building things out, your top 3 that you talked about: account takeover, financial fraud, authentication, and authorization exploitation. These are things that we often think about when it comes to how do we get better. I'd love to know, what do you think is the most underrated or overlooked type of attack pattern?
For me, the most interesting attack pattern is actually privileged access misuse. And I think one of the biggest things here is that when we look at this, is really comes down to every single financial application, really any software application, requires a custom customer support tool of some kind, because you need to be able to integrate directly to your software. You might be using different third parties to help you to collect information, customer feedback, support stuff, right? Problems that they're facing, but you still need to be able to go act on it, right? And in early phases, that might be an engineer directly going to go fix the problem, right? And as you evolve as an organization, you say, this is a very expensive use of an engineer. So instead, I'm going to build a custom interface, an administrative interface for our customer support agents, who can then do that support for them and then act on the behalf of the user, but in a more privileged access way to our product itself. So that could be things like checking balances, maybe updating certain information after doing some KYC verification over the phone. These are all necessary when it comes to a FinTech application. But the reason why I think this is the most interesting and overlooked attack vector is that it also, just like some of the others, it's not technical. If you wanted to perform a privileged access abuse attack of some kind, really all you need to do is have access to this interface. And that could be you as a customer support agent doing things you're not supposed to do, right? And I think one of the most basic controls in place is just preventing or limiting how much a customer support agent can do within a day. But I think one real world example I wanted to talk about was with Coinbase, actually. And so a little while ago, they had a bribery issue where these attackers, rather than going for some sort of technical attack, where they try to abuse business logic and do a bunch of payload sending, wear their hoodies over their head, right? All they did was send a message over to some of the Coinbase administrators who are doing customer support saying, hey, if you would give us some information that you already have access to within your customer support portal, you want to export that data for us, we'll pay you a good amount of money, right? And for an employee, I think we fail to look at it from an organizational standpoint. A lot of companies, they take great pride in their company culture. They take great pride in their product. And I think it's a good thing. This is a great thing to be able to build from. But they fail to really understand that people have different motivations. And for a lot of people, it's a job. That's it. And they're doing it for different incentives, right? They may not be super passionate about what they're doing. It's just the job for them to do. And if there's an offer on the table for them to leverage what's available at their job to go and do stuff, no background check would have ever caught this. It's not like these customer support agents had any sort of criminal record for you to verify or look into. It's just they got an enticing offer to run some scripts that are provided to them in exchange for an anonymous fee.
And I do think it's important that organizations, especially leadership, just recognize that, because we talk about culture, raw product, this and that, funding. At the end of the day, this is a job to most people. And the whole idea of we want to hire people who are bought into the mission. I get it. And you hear all the time, but once you scale to a certain number of people, that's just not practical, or the better word is realistic, right? To imagine that every single one of my people have been indoctrinated into our culture. And so for those very reasons, you have to recognize that that is a risk, specifically and especially as you get larger. And it makes sense that for Coinbase, which started out as this really exciting, and it still is, but really exciting space to be. And you did have really amazing employees working and creating this very strong security program, that eventually you will have other employees that are just not as in it, right, as maybe your earlier employees were.
And I think that's a natural part of running a business, right? Not everyone is going to be the best hire that you've made, and you can't guarantee that the culture is going to be embedded in that person forever.
And let's be honest, you probably don't have the budget to hire the most amazing person for every single role that's out there.
Yeah, absolutely.
So, all right, so there are some clear patterns as to what needs to be done. We just talked about all the different attack patterns, what you could possibly do to help reduce some of that risk. In the white paper, it's recommended that product organizations, so security, engineering, product, that they create a single authoritative inventory of what a product can do and who can do it. So why is this quote unquote boring documentation actually a critical reference for security?
Yeah, it's a really important piece of documentation for security teams because it serves as central context for us to build around, right? And to explain that a little bit more, in the beginning phases when you're building out your security program, the expectations of how the product functions is kind of inherent, right? You have some tribal knowledge of, I know an admin's supposed to be able to touch these features, I know these things, I need to test for that, right? Because that just makes sense. But as your organization grows and scales, you can't rely on an individual person forever, right? That person might end up leaving the organization, right? This person may not be available that day, when the day that you need them either. And when we need to start building automations around certain processes that we might have, whether it is some sort of testing and validation of those behaviors continuously over time, then we can't simply just have it off the top of our head, right? We need to be able to have something referenceable and understand where it's coming from and know if there is some sort of deviation, what is the deviation and why did it matter to us in the first place? So having this kind of information also prevents us from having that kind of back and forth discussions a lot of the times that you might see internally, that we just can't simply align on what's the expectation. Now we know what the expectation is, we know what the test is that we're supposed to be doing or the behavior we're supposed to validate. If it doesn't meet that, then it's a pretty simple conversation of, do we still like it or do we want to change our mind?
So this documentation is really managing operational risk of the security function, which arguably is a really important function within a FinTech product, right? Because it's directly tied to the business goals and, more importantly, consumer trust.
And then I think one of the big things to call out here is that as our organization grows and our security function grows, right, as our product function grows, we're going to have new people cycle in and out. The person that's going to take us from that 10-person startup that we're in, that's going to take us to the next billion-dollar unicorn or possibly decacorn, right? Those are going to be different parties that come in. And I think one of the most difficult conversations I hear is, oh, that's how we've always done it. If that's how you've always done it, that doesn't mean it's going to get you to where you want to be next. And so having this quote-unquote boring documentation of how our product operates gives us context for how we operate today, whether that's still justifiable in how we want to operate in the future. And when we start talking about the world of AI agents running things, the AI agent, even if we have it go run all of our processes and stuff like that for us and perform these actions on our behalf, we have to write down those expectations. If we don't have those expectations written down, it's going to be just as painful for me to have to keep prompting my agent and say, no, that's the wrong thing, right? It's because I didn't tell it the right thing in the first place.
And I think the documentation too, it's not a wrong, what we've talked about previously, it's different priorities at different times. And as you mature, as you get bigger, as you have more customers, different variety of customers, different features, right? Those priorities are going to start looking different. And so that context is critical for anyone that comes in, especially new, to understand how to operate within why you made those decisions in the first place, because there's always a reason for why that decision was made. I hate it when I talk to leaders and they're like, they come into a place and they're like, they're doing it all wrong. It's like, no, they're not doing it wrong, right? They did it because of certain reasons, and for those reasons at that time it was the right thing to do. But now that you've got brought along, it could be safe to say that this is not the right way to do things to get to where we're going. So one of my gripes is when leaders come in and just shit on what's been done. And in reality, there's a reason for why those decisions were made. All right, so the time and effort put into creating and maintaining this, it sounds like it truly is worth millions in time, effort, and potential breaches. So to close out, if a listener is building a new FinTech product tomorrow, what is the first security control they should implement that isn't just a universal standard?
Yeah, I think if you're building out a FinTech application today, then the most important thing that a product security leader should do is to really understand the value chain of their product. And just write down, it doesn't even need to be something technical, right? Just write down what are the features that are most important to our application and why people use it. Is it because we make it easy to integrate with banks? Is it because we make it easy for them to conduct transactions, right? And then one layer deeper, just beyond that, is to identify what are the security controls that we have put in place to make sure that we can support that trust, that guarantee that we're doing what we have thought about, the things that could go wrong, and how we're protecting against that. It's fine if the answer is that we're not doing a great job, right? Because we
need a baseline.
But this is an exercise that can be done in a day, right? Look at the application, talk to your product leaders, understand what's important, talk to your security practitioners within the organization and see what we've already put in place. And if we haven't done much, that's okay. Just write it down. And the ones that we have put in place, that next step is just validating that they work as we expect them to do.
When it comes back to the value chain, you'd be surprised as to how many security leaders don't actually know what they're protecting, right? So security leaders have to know how to sell the product, because by knowing how to sell it, you inherently know what's valuable and why people are buying. And that is really what you need to be protecting and prioritizing. Cool. Well, thank you guys for sticking out and listening to this entire kind of conversation. We think that this is a really important one. Excited to share this information with all of you. If you guys have any questions or want to continue the conversation or add to the conversation, please feel free, reach out. Contribute to the discussion at large. Share this with other people. We're really excited about how specifically product security is really evolving in this space. And at the end of the day, it really is. It's all about trust.
Absolutely. We want to hear from you guys in terms of what are you doing different in this new age of product security? How have you gone beyond from just tickets to something that's actually and truly a business enabler?